At one point this season, Shedeur Sanders was listed as a third-string quarterback, a quiet dismissal from a staff that hadn't yet seen his full depth. That silence was louder than words, fueling a mental battle far beyond the sidelines. But Sunday changed everything. With the game, and maybe his role in the franchise, on the line, Sanders orchestrated a masterful final drive that wasn't just about football intelligence. It was about mental toughness born from adversity. If you're into the real story and all the messy twists they don't show on highlight reels, go ahead and subscribe. And if you're sticking around to see how this Browns QB chaos plays out, you should definitely be subscribed. He'd been tested, benched, overlooked, and still he rose. What Sanders unpacked afterward revealed the full scope of his journey. He spoke of spiritual warfare, feeling attacked through those around him, and eventually confronting those emotions with honesty, including with Stefanski. That conversation, that understanding, helped realign a broken dynamic. It allowed Sanders to lead with more than talent, to lead with character, backed by teammates like Quinn Shawn and driven by personal growth. Sanders turned a marginalized rookie season into the start of something transformative. The Browns walk off the field after beating the Bengals, and on paper, it looks like just another gritty win, another late drive, another close finish, another box score people will skim and forget by Tuesday. But this one doesn't fade. This one lingers. Because the win wasn't the story. What came after was. Shedeur Sanders just led a game-winning drive against a division rival, and instead of chest-thumping or stat-flexing, he's carrying something heavier. You can see it before he even speaks. This isn't adrenaline. This isn't hype. This is relief mixed with exhaustion, the kind that only comes from surviving something deeper than football. The Bengals game becomes the backdrop, not the headline, because what Sanders reveals after this one turns a routine post-game moment into something raw, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. On the field, Sanders did exactly what a quarterback is paid to do. He steadied himself late. He didn't force throws. He stayed composed when the margin for error vanished. That final drive wasn't flashy, but it was controlled, deliberate, and confident. The kind of drive coaches say they want but rarely trust rookies to run. This matters because of how the season had gone. Sanders wasn't handed anything. He wasn't protected from criticism. He wasn't insulated from pressure. At times, he wasn't even treated like the future. He had been labeled, doubted, and pushed down depth charts. And yet, when the game demanded clarity, he delivered it. That last drive against Cincinnati wasn't about arm strength or scheme. It was about mental toughness. It was about staying present when everything around you has been trying to knock you off balance for months. Then he gets to the podium, and everything shifts. Sanders doesn't start with football cliches. He doesn't recap the drive. He doesn't talk about execution. Instead, he opens a door most rookies keep locked, especially this early. He talks about struggling, about darkness, about spiritual warfare, about feeling attacked not just internally, but through the people around him. That's the phrase that lands hard. Fighting the devil through those around him. This isn't metaphor for pressure. This is him describing a real, ongoing battle he's been carrying all season. His voice doesn't shake for attention. It shakes because he's tired of holding it in. This isn't a planned message. This is something spilling out after months of containment. For a league that rewards toughness but punishes vulnerability, Sanders does the opposite of what most players would do in this moment. Sanders explains that this season was never just about football. It was about learning how to deal with emotions, how to handle mental attacks, how to stay grounded when you feel misunderstood, overlooked, or disrespected. He admits there were moments he wasn't himself, moments he was in his head, moments when the noise, the pressure, and the perceived favoritism around him started to weigh heavier than any defensive front. He doesn't name names. He doesn't accuse. He just tells the truth as he lived it. For a rookie quarterback, this level of honesty is rare. He isn't presenting himself as a victim. He's explaining the cost of growth, the toll of being in an environment where belief didn't always feel mutual, and where he had to find stability somewhere deeper than the playbook. That context matters when Kevin Stefanski enters the picture. Throughout the season, the relationship between coach and quarterback felt distant from the outside, strictly professional. controlled, guarded. Sanders now reveals there was more happening behind the scenes. He says they had a real conversation that week, not about reads or footwork, but about understanding each other as people. Sanders doesn't frame it as confrontation. He frames it as clarity. Two men finally speaking honestly instead of through roles. That conversation, according to Sanders, changed things. It didn't erase the past. It didn't magically fix everything, but it created respect. It suggested that Stefanski saw him differently, not just as a quarterback on a depth chart, but as someone navigating real battles while trying to lead a team. This is where the story sharpens. Sanders implies that growth happened on both sides, that Stefanski may have recognized mistakes, that communication or lack of it had consequences, and that acknowledging those moments mattered more than pretending they never happened. The coach-player relationship shifts from rigid hierarchy to human connection. Sanders doesn't celebrate it. He doesn't dramatize it. He simply states it as fact. Something changed. Something opened. And that mattered. In a league where egos often block introspection, that admission alone is significant. It suggests that Sanders didn't just earn trust with performance, but with honesty. And that Stefanski, whether publicly or privately, met him halfway. Sanders then talks about the darkest stretch of the season, the moments when he wasn't starting, when he was sidelined, when his confidence was tested not by opponents, but by isolation. This is where brotherhood enters the story. Sanders shares that teammates stepped in when he was struggling, that they refused to let him disappear. That one teammate, Quinn Sean, came to his house during his lowest point and spoke life into him. That moment isn't about football. It's about survival, about someone recognizing that leadership doesn't always look like motivation speeches in a locker room. Sometimes it looks like showing up when someone is quiet and hurting. Sanders credits that support with pulling him out of a dark mental space, with reminding him who he was beyond the role he was temporarily stripped of. By the time Sanders returns to the field, something is different, not louder, not flashier, quieter, more centered. He talks about maturity, about learning how to handle feelings instead of suppressing them, about realizing that strength doesn't always mean silence. The Bengals win becomes proof of that growth, not because of stats, but because of composure, because of leadership, because he didn't unravel when things got hard earlier in the game. His teammates noticed it. The locker room felt it. Sanders closes his reflection by making one thing clear. This season, with all its setbacks and tension, shaped him. It didn't break him. And if this is a foundation, then what comes next isn't just about football success. It's about a quarterback who has already survived things most players never admit they face. Throughout the season, Shedeur Sanders played snaps that didn't always make headlines but mattered deeply. Every appearance, every rep, even in games where the result was already decided, became a kind of personal test, not of skill, but of patience, composure, and belief. When he wasn't starting, he still showed up to meetings. He still practiced like the job was his. The cameras weren't watching. The critics weren't talking. But he stayed focused. That matters, especially for a rookie who could have gone quiet or bitter. Instead, he kept preparing for a moment no one guaranteed would come. And when the Browns called on him, when the opportunity finally aligned with preparation, Sanders didn't just perform. He showed what it looks like when talent meets readiness. Every match became a layer of experience, resilience, and growth. When Sanders talks now, there's a weight behind every word, not because he's dramatic, but because everything he says is earned. He knows what it's like to be overlooked. He knows what it's like to question whether you belong. And he knows what it feels like to be given the ball and told to prove it. He doesn't play the martyr. He plays the long game. That's what stands out. He frames the season not as something done to him, but as something that refined him, a test that pushed him to develop not just as a quarterback, but as a man. His vulnerability isn't packaged for PR. It comes from somewhere real. When he says he battled mentally, spiritually, emotionally, he's not just checking boxes. He's explaining survival, and doing it in a league that rarely makes space for those conversations. At that podium, after the Bengals game, he says something that still sticks. He says he wasn't always okay, that at times he felt like the devil was working through people around him. Not fans, not opponents, people close. That level of honesty hits different when you realize it's coming from a 21-year-old, someone who just won a crucial divisional game and could have easily played the role. But he didn't. He chose to be real instead of polished. That says more about who he is than any stat line. And maybe more than anything, it's the emotional fatigue in his voice that gives it gravity. He isn't trying to shock anyone. He's just tired of carrying it alone. And for a few minutes under those lights, he decides not to. The shift in tone with Kevin Stefanski is subtle but significant. That real conversation they had earlier in the week, that's not just a storyline. It's a turning point. Sanders didn't share every detail, but the implication was clear. There was distance between them. Mistrust, maybe. A sense that Sanders wasn't being fully seen for who he is, not just as a player, but as a person. And Stefanski, according to Sanders, finally saw that, not with a speech, but with presence, with listening. The kind of understanding that only comes when someone stops managing and starts relating. It was overdue, but it mattered. And Sanders, without gushing, made it known. That moment gave him peace and clarity and maybe, for the first time, real partnership. If Stefanski speaks publicly about it, he'll probably be careful. Coaches often are. But behind the scenes, the signs were already there. The fact that Sanders got the ball late in a high-stakes game wasn't an accident. It was trust. Finally, for a coach who's been questioned for his quarterback decisions all season, Stefanski betting on Sanders in that moment was a message, not just to fans, not just to the media, but to Shedeur himself. It said, "We see you," after months of mixed signals. That decision said more than any endorsement could. And Sanders responded not with theatrics, but with execution. He did the job. Clean, focused, and unbothered by the noise. Earlier in the year, it was a different story. When Sanders was third string, when he was barely mentioned in press conferences, when fans debated whether he was even in the Browns' future plans. He didn't lash out, but he felt it. He said the low moments hit harder than expected. That being sidelined wasn't just a football thing. It was a mental thing. Feeling invisible, feeling muted, and then questioning your value because of it. That's when Quinn Sean stepped in. A teammate who didn't just offer encouragement, but physically showed up at Sanders' home. No cameras, no speeches, just presence. That moment, Sanders says, kept him grounded. It reminded him he wasn't alone. That real brotherhood means doing the inconvenient thing, and that sometimes is what saves a season. From that moment forward, Sanders locked in. Practice wasn't just reps anymore. It was reclamation of confidence, of identity, of his future. He treated scout team snaps like auditions. He stayed vocal, engaged, watching tape like a starter, even when he wasn't one. That's the difference between someone waiting for a break and someone preparing for it. The players around him noticed it. The shift, the steadiness, the maturity. When the opportunity came, they weren't surprised he rose to it. They expected it. And that says something about how far he'd come, not just in skill, but in trust. That's what ultimately earned him the shot in the Bengals game. That's what made the win feel bigger than the scoreboard. The final minutes of that game are now frozen in Cleveland fans' memories, not because it was flawless, but because it was fearless. Sanders didn't flinch. He didn't overthink. He didn't play like someone carrying scars from the bench. He played like someone who had already worked through the worst parts in silence and was now finally getting to speak through the game. Every throw was calculated, not cautious, controlled. Every audible made sense. Every timeout had purpose. It looked like a quarterback who understood that football isn't just physical, it's spiritual, too. That drive said more than any post-game quote. It proved that Sanders isn't just playing for a contract or a role. He's playing with purpose. And after everything this season threw at him, he's still here, standing, leading, winning. Now that the game is over, the full weight of the season starts to make sense. This wasn't redemption arc crafted in some perfect script. It was a survival story told through ugly wins, emotional breakdowns, and brief flashes of brilliance that most people missed, unless you were paying attention. Sanders never asked for sympathy. He asked for a fair shot. And even when he didn't get it, he stayed ready. Whether he was buried on the depth chart or playing spot duty, every snap became a slow, grinding process of proving something to himself. That's what made this final act so different. It wasn't a sudden breakout. It was a culmination of months of slow, invisible work. A quarterback evolving right in front of everyone, just quietly enough that people only noticed when it was undeniable. Sanders said the hardest part wasn't being doubted. It was being silenced. The feeling that even when he tried to speak, no one was really listening. That's what made his honesty so necessary after the Bengals game. When he said he was dealing with spiritual warfare, people blinked. When he said he felt the enemy working through those around him, it wasn't a metaphor. He was being literal. And if that sounds dramatic, it's because no one expects a rookie quarterback to be that open. But he didn't say it for shock value. He said it because keeping it in any longer was breaking him. The fact that he chose to release it publicly right after a win was no accident. That was the first time he felt safe enough to share the full story. And he used the moment to do it on his terms. That safety didn't come from a PR team or a media strategy. It came from a coach finally seeing the full person behind the player. Stefanski may not have handled everything perfectly, but according to Sanders, he did one thing right. He listened. That conversation between them didn't change the scoreboard. It didn't change the playbook. But it changed how Sanders felt walking into the building. It gave him room to stop performing and start trusting. That's the real breakthrough. Not just that Stefanski heard him, but that Sanders no longer felt alone. When players feel like their coaches actually know them, they stop hiding. And when they stop hiding, they start leading. That shift was visible in every snap Sanders took in that Bengals game. He wasn't always this steady. Earlier in the year, the silence nearly swallowed him. The demotions, the cold shoulders, the passive comments. Those things add up. For a young quarterback, it's easy to start believing the worst about yourself. That's when the support system kicked in. Quinn Shawn didn't just check in with a text. He pulled up in person. That small gesture hit harder than any locker room speech. It was one of the few times Sanders says he felt genuinely seen that week. Moments like that don't show up in box scores, but they define careers. Because when someone's on the verge of mentally checking out, all it takes is one person to remind them they matter. That's what Quinn did, and Sanders never forgot it. So when Sanders stood in front of the media and talked about growth, he wasn't just talking about learning a new offense. He was talking about learning how to survive emotional collapse, how to dig out of mental spirals without losing himself in the process. He didn't hide the fact that it got dark, that the pressure, the disrespect, the silence, it all wore him down. But he also didn't stay in that place. And that's what makes his story different. He broke, yes, but he rebuilt. And now when he talks, he's not just reflecting, he's instructing, sharing not just the what, but the how to get through it, how to keep believing, how to rise with your character intact. Stefanski hasn't gone into detail about that internal shift, but his decisions say enough. Giving Sanders control in the fourth quarter of a division game, that wasn't just about need. That was about trust. And maybe even an apology, one delivered through action instead of words. For all the tension that existed earlier in the season, Stefanski had a chance to double down on his old decisions. He didn't. He adapted. And while the public may never know the full extent of what passed between them, it's clear something real happened. Sanders doesn't throw Stefanski under the bus. He acknowledges the complexity. But more than anything, he credits that one honest exchange for setting the tone for everything that followed. You could see it in practice, too. The way teammates rallied around him. The way coaches started asking him more questions, giving him more reps, treating him like a leader, not a placeholder. It wasn't forced. It was earned. Every meeting he sat through, every drill he attacked, every time he took notes, even when he wasn't starting. That consistency paid off when it mattered most, and it gave him the emotional runway to step into the Bengals game with clarity. He wasn't trying to win anyone over anymore. He was playing like someone who finally believed what he'd been telling himself all year. You belong. That final drive wasn't just about clock management. It was about poise. The Browns needed calm. Sanders gave them more than that. He gave them belief. His eyes never darted. His pace never rushed. It looked like someone who had already fought every internal battle there was, and wasn't afraid of this one. The moment never got too big because he'd already survived the stuff that doesn't make highlight reels. The private breakdowns, the long nights, the doubt. And now, in the closing seconds of a crucial game, he was steady. He didn't yell after the score. He didn't gesture wildly. He just exhaled, because this wasn't about proving something to the crowd. This was about proving something to himself. When Sanders reflects on this season, he doesn't talk about wins and losses. He talks about mindset, the ability to show grace when you're frustrated, the strength it takes not to retaliate when you feel disrespected, the discipline to keep showing up even when the people around you don't seem to believe in you yet. He says he had to learn how to feel things without being overwhelmed by them, how to stop letting the silence in the room become a story in his head. That's growth most players aren't forced into their rookie year. But he was, and he took the challenge. What sets him apart isn't just what he's been through. It's how he handled it, without pettiness, without public complaints. Just patience, presence, and a quiet confidence that finally got loud when it needed to. What started as a chaotic, uncertain season ended as something foundational. A story he'll tell for years, not because of how glamorous it was, but because of how real it was. Because when it's all stripped down, leadership isn't about perfection. It's about being steady in the storm. Sanders didn't just make it through a tough season. He became something because of it, and the team saw it. The final games weren't about testing him anymore. They were about trusting him, trusting that all the battles he fought off camera had turned him into someone you could hand the game to. No shortcuts, no golden boy treatment, just growth earned the hard way. The moments he spent benched, doubted, overlooked, they didn't harden him. They humbled him. They showed him who was in his corner and who just liked the spotlight. And when he speaks now, he speaks from experience. Not the kind you boast about, but the kind you survive. The kind that changes how you see people. The kind that makes you pay attention to who checks on you when you're quiet. He said it himself. This was more than football. It was about learning how to fight invisible battles. And the people who showed up for him during those times, he'll remember them longer than any stat or award. As for Stefanski, whatever tension existed at the start of the year now feels like a necessary part of the story. Because without that strain, there wouldn't have been that breakthrough. And without the breakthrough, there wouldn't have been this version of Sanders. Their relationship, once stiff and distant, now has something real beneath it. Mutual respect. And maybe even something closer to understanding. Stefanski saw a quarterback evolve. And Sanders saw a coach willing to change. That doesn't fix everything, but opens a door for what's next. And right now, what's next finally looks like something worth building. So if you've been following the saga from the start, you know this wasn't just another quarterback getting reps. This was a rookie ripping off the label, stepping out of the shadow, and becoming someone who leads not just because of what he can do, but because of what he's been through. If you're here for more stories like this, real, raw, and just the right kind of messy, go ahead and tap that like button. Drop a comment with your thoughts, especially if you saw the change in Sanders before the media did. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because this season might be over, but the story, it's just getting started.